Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest in Third Way's series of virtual events. I'm Mieke Eoyang. I run the National Security Program. For those of you who've been tuning in regularly, I am a new Third Way moderator to this series, but I'm very honored to be here and present what I think we all consider an essential conversation in this election cycle, which is how do we understand foreign interference in our elections, which we have all been tremendously worried about. And I am very honored to be joined today by two people who have had a front row seat to foreign interference since this became an issue that the public was deeply concerned about. First, Congressman Himes, who is a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. As you may know, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence was one of the first government entities to acknowledge foreign and especially Russian interference in October of 2016. They had been observing in their deliberations and their watching of the intelligence community what had been going on. And I'm also joined by Laura Rosenberger, who was the foreign policy advisor to Secretary Clinton's presidential campaign in 2016, has been a longtime career foreign service officer and focused on Russia, and really saw and sounded the alarm with Secretary Clinton about Russian interference in the 2016 election, and since then has devoted her career to tracking foreign interference at the German Marshall Fund's Alliance for Securing Democracy. So I'm very glad that we can have these two for this essential conversation, which of course has tremendous implications for us in the 2020 election. So first, for the audience, I want to do a little review of what happened. In 2016, what were the key factors of foreign interference, and what have we learned and done since then to respond to that interference? Congressman, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, at this point, there is a wide array of literature which answers that question in fairly loving detail. The intelligence community, of course, put out an unclassified description of what occurred that actually gets to an awful lot of the information that exists, period. Of course, the Senate did a now public investigation, as did the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Even CrowdStrike, which was early involved in the hack of the Democratic National Committee, has information about what they saw. So it's out there in loving detail. The summary, of course, would be you can sort of classify the Russian hack of our election into two and let me say 2.5 categories, right? On the one hand, there was the incitement, the purchase of the fake Twitter accounts, the fake Facebook accounts, the creation of fake rallies that actually drew people to street corners. There was that whole manipulation of the many, let's say, tension points that exist, whether they're racial or religious or what have you. They did a pretty good job at setting up all of these very inflammatory catalysts, if you will, that ultimately pointed in the direction of anger directed at Hillary Clinton. That's number one. Number two, of course, was the much more technical breach of the DNC and of other organizations. That still remains a little cloudy. But, obviously the breach of the DNC allowed them through WikiLeaks to selectively leak information, which was, created certainly an awful lot of antagonism inside the Democratic Party. And then the half that I reserved, because I said 2.5, the half, of course, is, a scary but less discussed aspect of this, which was the probing of the technical election infrastructure around the country. That panicked a bunch of people right out of the box, because people said, oh my God, what if vote counts were manipulated, et cetera. There is, of course, zero evidence that there was any manipulation of vote counts. And in fact, that would be pretty hard to do, really quite hard to do. And it would probably be identifiable. But nonetheless, we know that the Russians, and by the way, others, did probe the databases. They wanted to know what the so-called battle space looked like. And so that too is, even though it wasn't a big part of what happened in 2016, is absolutely worthy of attention.
Yeah. Laura, we've learned a lot of things since the 2016 election, and people have taken steps to try and mitigate that. What steps have we seen by the private sector and others to identify and address this kind of manipulation?
Yeah, thanks. And I think Congressman Himes gave a really good overview of sort of the suite of tactics that we saw in the 2016 cycle. I think in terms of what we've seen, steps taken since 2016, particularly by the private sector, as you asked, they fall in a couple of categories. The first is a really basic one. It's acknowledging the problem, which actually wasn't really the case, even right in the aftermath of the 2016 election. Mark Zuckerberg had big doubts about Facebook's being used in this way. And so you can't really address the problem until you acknowledge it. And it took longer than many of us would have liked to get to that acknowledgement point, but we did. And so that's a good thing. Very, very basic step. Step two is we've certainly seen the platforms increase their ability to identify certain kinds of platform manipulation. The platforms have a term that they use, coordinated inauthentic behavior, for the kinds of things that we saw the Internet Research Agency, which was the major Russian troll farm that folks may have heard about, but also Russian military intelligence entities. The GRU also had some fake accounts that they were operating in the 2016 cycle on social media. So this coordinated inauthentic behavior frame is one that the platforms have used to get at a certain kind of platform manipulation by foreign actors. Now, it does not cover all of the kinds of manipulation that we see, and maybe that's something we can talk about later, but they've at least increased their ability to identify and target this kind of activity. I would note, though, that when they do remove a lot of that content, as they now regularly do, a lot of times that those findings are actually based on information that's shared by private sector researchers, outside researchers who are working with the platforms to help do their work for them. Some are nonprofit, some are for-profit companies, but that are helping the platforms with this. And the other piece of it is sometimes there's tips from law enforcement that allow the platforms to identify some of this behavior. And the reason that I bring this piece of it up is I think this is a really important thing that we've seen progress on, but much more that needs to be done. And that's information sharing between different actors. There's a lot of talk in this space about the need for whole of society solutions and whole of society, actions. But that is sort of meaningless if we don't figure out practical mechanisms to do so. And in the space of identifying nefarious foreign activity to manipulate the social media platforms, one of the most important things that we've seen is the ability to share information between different actors. Government has certain information on what foreign entities are doing. Platforms have certain information on what's happening on their platforms. Researchers can look at things from different angles. So the information sharing piece has seen progress, but it remains there's a lot left to do. The last piece I would just say, and we could go, we could go into more detail on each of these, is, on the cybersecurity side, particularly on the election infrastructure side, I do think this is an area where we have seen a lot of activity by both the federal government and state and local governments. This is less of a private sector piece, although parts of this infrastructure are, private sector pieces. A lot of the suppliers involved in providing election infrastructure are private companies. There has been a lot of attention to addressing some of these vulnerabilities in our electoral infrastructure in the past few years. Again, I think there's probably still a ways to go, and we've unfortunately not been able to get the kind of funding that a lot of folks in Congress, a lot of Democrats have really pushed for to enhance election security. But there have been steps taken there, and I think that is important to acknowledge.
Yeah, Congressman, let's go to that. I know that a lot of you and a lot of your colleagues have been working really hard to secure funds and to get the administration to acknowledge the problem and to help secure our next elections. How do you assess where we are on getting the government to address this problem, recognizing that we have a problem of acknowledging this at the very top?
Yeah, well, I think Laura is exactly right. In that, going into 2016, we were babes in the woods on this stuff. I mean, we had no one, I think, had focused from, the top levels of the security establishment in DC. And I don't mean they hadn't focused, but, it really wasn't perceived as a vulnerability, down to the registrar of voters in Wilton, Connecticut. Today we're in a very different world where, here in the state of Connecticut, for example, and this reflects the country, we've really made pretty dramatic investments in our technology and our training of the people that administer our infrastructure. And so I think we've made really good progress there. Now, it's important to frame this right? This is not a problem that you solve. This is a problem that you manage over time. Anybody who understands IT vulnerabilities knows that the bad guys are they're always working. And so even though I praise the efforts we've made, this must, of course, be an ongoing effort. The centralized ability to detect within the Department of Homeland Security and the intelligence community is very, very good. People don't know how good it is because they can't know how good it is, otherwise our antagonists will know. But it's not perfect, and again, that has to be a continued area of focus. Where we've really fallen down, Mieke, is the sort of strategic chessboard. And I will tender a bipartisan critique of both of the last administrations. The Obama administration, when they announced the hack, in my opinion, and by the way, I've had this fight with Susan Rice and others, and there's a good fight and a good debate to be had. But in my opinion, the response of the Obama administration was not a response that would ultimately deter future behavior. The PNGing of a number of Russian diplomats and the shutting down of facilities, et cetera, was not a deterrent. And so I had this conversation with the last administration a number of times. I think that was the moment to do things that indicated that an attack on our electoral system was as bad as an attack on a hospital or on any other critical infrastructure, and extract a price that would create a deterrent. Of course, the current administration has been even worse, right? Because the President of the United States, in effect, denies that it occurred. I mean, I think he may be the one person in the United States, other than some of his closest minions, that won't accept that this occurred, that will go out of his way to say, well, Vladimir assured me that it didn't happen, and it was a strong assurance. I mean, that's a catastrophe, right? Because what it does is it opens the door. And look, again, I have my opinions about the Obama administration, which I express. But right now in the Kremlin, people are saying, you know what? At the highest levels of leadership in the United States, when we do this stuff, we don't really pay a cost, and that's a very dangerous place to be.
Yeah, Laura, I'm sure you've spent a lot of time thinking about what an appropriate deterrent response would be. So like if we could live in the alternate reality where you are formulating the government's deterrent response after 2016, what did you have in mind? What could we have done?
I don't think that you want to know what I had in mind. I remember one particular conversation in the late summer of 2016 with a few colleagues on the campaign where I had some particularly interesting ideas on what we needed to do here. But I think I want to sort of take one step back and pivot off of something that Congressman Himes rightly pointed out. And he talked about the need for a real strategic response to this. And I think there's the deterrence and cost imposition piece, and I'll come back to that in 1 second. But I think one of the real challenges that we see with these suite of issues is that these tools that are being used fall in cracks and seams in our government bureaucracy, and they fall in cracks and seams in our general sort of approach and framework to dealing with state-on-state conflict. Right? These are asymmetric tools. They fall, short of war, right? They're in what is often referred to as the gray zone. And the advantage usually falls to the aggressor in the use of these sorts of tactics. And I don't think that we as a government or really a national security community have quite come up yet with the toolkit that we need to respond to these sorts of asymmetric tactics and to do so in an integrated way. It's an area I've spent a ton of time on over the past few years, and I'm happy to toss out some ideas. But I think there's two basic buckets. One is we need to restructure how we work on these issues internally in government. We need to be making sure that we see the whole picture in terms of the threat streams, as well as the full suite of policy responses and the levers that we can pull. And that's both on the analytic side and the intelligence community. And I know Congress actually passed in the NDAA last year an authorization for the creation of a national counter-malign influence center, if I'm getting the name of it right. It was in the Intel Auth bill, actually. The DNI has not moved out on that yet, but that's the kind of thing I think we need for a real holistic analysis. And then that has to be accompanied by a policy integration function whether that's in the National Security Council or somewhere else, that again brings that full picture together so you really can have a strategic response. On the deterrent side, I will confess that I think there are a number of pieces of this that are not deterrable. I think that that so much of the asymmetric toolkit, the cyber tools, the information warfare tools are built into the doctrine of Moscow and Beijing and Tehran. And this is really part and parcel of how they think states should do business. We don't believe it's how states should do business, but they do. And I don't believe we're going to fully knock them off their ability to do that. And we could have a longer conversation. There's been many, many discussions about cyber deterrence itself and what that means. And the Cyber Solarium Commission came out with some interesting concepts around layered deterrence and all that, which are interesting. But I think we need to think about deterrence in new ways. Now, that's not to say either A, we can't deter, or B, we shouldn't impose costs, right? Because I do think for certain high-end activities, we can and should attempt to deter. And we certainly do need to be imposing costs, if not for necessarily knocking the particular actor who is engaging in them off from them, but rather keeping others from getting in the game. But I think the other piece of it is, deterrence by denial is something that we don't often think about enough in this equation. And so that resilience building point, right? Making the target surface less ripe and less able to be used in these ways, I think is really a key piece in how we think about this puzzle.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And part of this would not be so successful if there was not a demand signal from certain political actors that they welcome the interference on their behalf. I remember being at the Aspen Security Forum in 2017, and members of Congress on the panel were asked, what would they do if they were given an offer of help of foreign interference? Would they report to the FBI? And not everyone on the panel saw it as something that should be reported to the FBI. And we've seen, as part of the impeachment proceedings that the congressman was intimately involved in, that there were foreign actors trying to funnel campaign contributions and other kinds of help into political campaigns. Congressman, can you talk a little bit about how do we address the demand signal by candidates to foreign interference, and what's happening there with people attempting to influence the campaigns?
Yeah. Let me append a quick statement on deterrence, and then answer that question, because I do think the deterrence argument is really, really important. And look, I'm on one side of that argument, and I could give you a very clear answer to the question that you asked, Laura. It's immensely annoying to me that we are in the strategic position we are in, no credible deterrence, at the very same time that we are actually quite a bit better at this than the Russians are. And in fact, their hack of the DNC was fairly primitive, which is why it was so rapidly found. I would have counseled, and in fact, I did counsel, it's not my job to do so, a demonstrative deterrent action. And what I mean by that is not anything that would have been classified as anything other than a demonstrative example of our capabilities. And you can sort of imagine what that might be. I mean, hit the Kremlin where it hurts. I don't know if we have this capability, but figure out how to make it impossible for the top 50 oligarchs to log into their Swiss bank accounts for a period of 3 weeks. Nobody dies, but boy, is that a signal. We don't say anything, and again, I don't know that we can do that, but something like that. That would have demonstrated our capabilities. And the counter argument, by the way, which is a very fair counter argument, and I completely admit this, the counter argument is that we are profoundly exposed to an exchange of cyber attacks. And that's true. That's true. It's one of the frustrating things with North Korea, right? I mean, I guess theoretically they could cause a lot of pain in the United States, and we might be able to flicker a bunch of light bulbs in Pyongyang because of the difference in the networks. So there is a strong counter argument there. But again, you look at the strategic chessboard there, and you say this is just not an escalation that Russia ultimately wins. Okay, that was more than a quick appendage. On the demand side, let me be quick on this one. Look, you're absolutely right. And one of the most dispiriting things in a month of or a quarter of immensely dispiriting things was my Republican colleagues deciding to deep six the proposed legislation, which would actually mandate that federal candidates take a foreign inquiry or foreign contribution to the FBI. Seems like that should be commonsensical, but apparently it's not. And so we're left with, you know, hoping that we can educate people to be wary of the inquiries that might be made. And I worry, by the way, just to open another slight line of inquiry here, you know, Russia worries me a little less in that regard than China does. China is much more nuanced and careful than Russia was in their efforts to manipulate our political system. You know, they're not about doing a fully attributable hack of some entity. They're about, over time, increasing influence. You know, we all know the stories of Confucius Institutes. We all know the stories of Beijing being very conscious of what public officials are sort of pro-China, against China. That's where I think we need to be particularly careful, because, you know, the possibility of you know, what seems like an innocent, you know, attempt to help could in fact be the strategic effort of an antagonist is very real.
Yeah, I'm keeping an eye on Q&A in the chat, and we will get to those very shortly. But I do think that you raise an excellent point, Congressman, and Laura's raised this as well. You know, we have talked about a lot of the election interference as if it's just Russia, but there are other actors out there. And Laura, I know you're tracking these things through the Alliance for Securing Democracy, and you're actually looking at sort of what kinds of things are happening on social media. Who else do we have to worry about, and what are they doing? How do their tactics differ from what we've seen from the Russians?
Thanks, Mieke. And I just want to really append to the Congressman's appendage. I want to pull this deterrence point through because it's one that I'm kind of obsessed with. I want to be clear, the kinds of things that Congressman, you're proposing in terms of going after the Kremlin and really imposing some costs, I'm fully on board with. Like, I fully think that we should be doing that. And I've also been quite critical of a lack of a significant response from the Obama administration in 2016. I guess my point is, I don't think we should be lulled into a belief that we will be able to deter this as a sort of endpoint and that it will sort of stop. I think that deterrence needs to be part of a bigger package, a bigger strategy, you know, that manages some of the challenges in the interim, even while we impose greater costs. So just to sort of clarify my thinking on that.
Yep.
You know, on the point about Mieke, you know, other actors, I guess I would put this. I want to sort of tease out one thing here, which is, you know, we're talking here a lot about election interference and talking about this in the election frame. And obviously there are certain things about elections that are particularly ripe and targeted for foreign interference, as the Russians did in 2016. But one of the things that we know the intelligence community assessment found, that the CISI reports have found, that other reports have found, was a primary goal of the Kremlin was actually not about the election itself, was simply about discrediting democracy, right? It's about undermining and weakening the foundations and pillars of democracy. And that's why, in fact, that we saw the social media activity from Russia's Internet Research Agency actually increase after the election in 2016. The volume of activity from those accounts really went into overdrive after Donald Trump was elected, with the goal of discrediting the election, weakening people's faith in democracy, and driving Americans against one another. And so I think there's an electoral piece of this, and there's no question about that, right? And we've talked about some of those particular elements. But I think there's a broader and ongoing effort that's about undermining and weakening democracy, that's particularly attractive for authoritarian regimes who don't have something really that's attractive to sell themselves. So weakening their competitors is a primary way that they seek to gain influence. And so when we talk about other actors, I see a lot of other actors that I think are engaged in that broader category of activity in terms of trying to interfere in democratic processes writ large, undermining weakened democratic institutions. The electoral interference piece specifically, while there are concerns that we've heard from intelligence community leaders about, you know, China, Iran, North Korea, my own view is that China in particular, to date, in my assessment, does not appear to have particularly election targeted activities in the United States or in a lot of other countries. We've certainly seen them do that kind of thing on Taiwan. We've seen a little bit of activity around influencing politicians in Australia, but China's efforts that we've seen to date seem to be much more broadly about, again, sowing doubt and confusion. China's actually really in the past, in the COVID era, changed its tactics quite a bit. It used to be that they were really focused on promoting China, right? The kinds of stuff that Congressman Himes was talking about. Promoting China as an attractive partner, and then suppressing content that was unfavorable to the Chinese Communist Party. We've seen in COVID times, as the party got more insecure, a real shift in some of the more sort of Russian-style tactics of spreading conspiracy theories and trying to undermine the United States by saying, look, the US is a mess. It's not able to fight COVID and be a partner to European countries. We, China, can be a good partner. The Trump administration's failed response to COVID certainly isn't helping us make the case that China's wrong on this. But it's really been about that broader sort of corruption of democratic processes through the information space, a lot of stuff in the economic coercion and malign financial influence space from China. Iran is a little more of an X factor to me. We've certainly seen evidence of Iran potentially boosting some candidates during the Democratic primary process. But really, more than anything, I would say trying to just use the Democratic primary process as an opportunity to sow division within the party to weaken Democrats from coming together around an ultimate nominee. Iran certainly has, sophisticated cyber capabilities that it could deploy if it wanted to. So I do think there would be potential for Iran to engage in that more electorally focused activity, but we haven't seen it to date. And then the Congressman mentioned North Korea earlier in terms of its cyber capabilities. And one of the things I think that we forget about is that actually one of the most significant early sort of hack and leak operations was actually by North Korea with the Sony hack, which was a destructive cyber attack on infrastructure, but they also weaponized the emails that were stolen from Sony officials to be embarrassing while threatening to bomb movie theaters, right? So you had a very sophisticated both cyber and information campaign that the North Koreans used. But again, that was separate from an electoral context.
Gotcha. So we've got some questions from the audience.
Wait, sorry, Mieke. Laura's absolutely right. The one category of things that she didn't mention that worries me is, and particularly after yesterday, though we don't know attribution on yesterday, is non-state actors, right?
Yeah.
And Laura and I need to have a private Zoom to talk about deterrability in this realm, but I think we would both agree that what's really scary about non-state actors is that they're almost by definition non-deterrable.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned that, right? For those who were not on Twitter last night, some appears to be non-state actors took over the Twitter's admin panel and was able to post tweets from Barack Obama and Joe Biden, Elon Musk and Bill Gates and others' Twitter accounts, and they were running a Bitcoin scam. And we've done a lot of work on the non-state actor criminal folks at the Third Way National Security Program. We're happy to have a longer conversation with folks about that anytime. We have a lot of thoughts on how we can go after those people and hold them accountable for their actions. They are sort of difficult to deter at the front end, but punishment can be a deterrence as well. But we have a question from Michael Lawan. And this comes back to the China issue that you guys have both touched on. We know that China's playing a long game. They are engaging in social media manipulation and trying to change US opinion over the long term. The question is what should we have what would a Biden administration approach to this be, since it seems like Trump is ignoring the problem, or the current administration is ignoring the problem?
Congressman, do you want to chime in first, or I'm happy to?
I think the pause you hear is an appreciation of the unbelievable complexity of the Rubiks Cube, which is, statesmanship against and with China, right? So let me offer up a quick framework, and then I'll defer to Laura, who did this, day to day inside an administration. First of all, we have to acknowledge that the Chinese are very different than the Russians. There's an anarchic quality to Russian activities here. And by that, I mean far less hierarchical, far more short-term, far more experimental than what we see from a very, very disciplined, careful, long-term strategic Chinese effort in national security generally, but certainly in the cyber realm. you know, when Russia does something or we think Russia does something, we spend an awful lot of time thinking about, well, was it this agency or was it this service? And, you know, there's this sort of an anarchic quality to it that is not present in Chinese activity. But, and here's the framework, you know, there's some areas where I think we just need to confront China head on. And those are areas of fundamental values, you know, whether it's the treatment of the Uyghur minorities or the imposition in violation of the Hong Kong agreements of, you know, of the elimination of the one country, two systems promise. We just need to confront those head on, open, with our allies, you know, kind of no conditionality. Then there's the commercial disputes, which, you know, are subject to the kind of, and should be undertaken with the kind of, you know, mind-bogglingly dull, you know, negotiations that the USTR and the State Department is so good at doing in order to get to a better place than we have been with China on trade. In this realm, you know, it is, to me, it feels like a very, a little bit of a cross between the two, right? You know, we need to make it very clear that our essential infrastructure is our essential infrastructure, and you don't get to try to steal IP from our contractors or, you know, pharmaceutical research or whatever it is. And we come down, as the Obama administration did when they issued the indictments of the, I think it was PLA folks that were undertaking commercial hacks. You know, we need in my opinion, we need a blend of very direct drawing of no cross lines, of red lines, with negotiation around this stuff. You know, both China and the United States are profoundly vulnerable because the economic ties are so important, are profoundly vulnerable to attacks from the outside by non-state actors, by vulnerabilities. Look, if there's a problem in a, you know, SAP supply chain program, China's as vulnerable to that as we are. And that's one of those areas where I think that even as we maintain clarity around what we won't tolerate, that we seek to engage with the Chinese to build trust and to find places where we can both benefit from cooperation.
Yeah. Laura, you are a long time China hand. You have thoughts on how we should approach this issue going forward?
Yeah, well, you know, for me, the first point, just to build on what Congressman Himes said, you know, the first point is our allies are essential here. And that is an area that this administration has not only completely ignored, but basically, you know, we've turned our allies into enemies at the same time that we're trying to push back on China. And that's just dumb. I mean, there's absolutely like nothing there that makes logical sense. And in particular, when we're talking about these sorts of democratic interference tactics, I think there's a few things that are really important with our allies. One is that, you know, these tactics are tricky because they hit sensitive political issues within our domestic politics. And so the tendency to date, I think, has been too much of each country addresses it itself, and that we haven't really taken coordinated alliance-based action to both build our collective resilience and to engage in, you know, cost imposition against these actors. And I think that's important when it comes to Russia. I think it's absolutely essential when it comes to China. You know, and in fact, we've seen, you know, significant turnabout by Europe in the past 6 months on China. I mean, past year and a half, but 6 months has really accelerated it. And really, it's no thanks to anything we've done. It's mostly thanks to the PRC showing its true colors, and European officials saying, you know, absolutely not what we want on our soil. But Europe needs a partner in that pushback. And we need to really step back up to that plate in a significant way. That's one. A related piece to what Congressman Himes was suggesting is, I'm a little skeptical of the idea of negotiating norms of behavior and guardrails with China. Having spent a lot of time trying to do so with them around cyber activity going back to 2010. And obviously there was the agreement that the Obama administration eventually reached in 2015 that was extraordinarily narrowly tailored and that lasted for a hot minute. But by that point, China had figured out other ways to get the data that it wanted. And then, you know, the agreement was essentially thrown out the window. So while I think that, you know, I'm not necessarily opposed to continuing to have that, attempting to have that kind of dialogue, I think it's also as important, if not more, that we work with our allies to chart out what those lines are, and that we have a shared understanding of what the definitions are of what's acceptable state behavior and what's not, so we can collectively enforce those, because I think that's a really key piece of it. The last piece of it is, for me, I have spent a lot of time looking at what I have called the global information contest, and the way in which China is engaging in a sophisticated effort to not only manipulate, narratives and the sort of online conversation, but also control digital infrastructure and set new rules around digital information governance. And there's a whole suite of activities playing out here, whether it's at the UN around the new cybercrime treaty, or whether it's in standards bodies where China and Huawei are trying to develop and push a new internet protocol that would allow state actors much greater access to information. To me, like, that's the game where we are not fully engaged and need to be investing significantly to make sure that China is not able to essentially create a global controlled and sovereign information space as it has domestically. And if you look at how quickly they've moved in Hong Kong to export some elements of their information controls, I think it's a real cautionary tale for what we could see on a more global basis.
Yeah, we have another audience question I want to bring it, which will bring us back to the election, which I think is useful. But in the context of Laura, you were saying that the Russians are wanting us to lack faith in our democracy. The question is, where is vote by mail vulnerable to foreign interference? But I want to talk about this and ask you guys about this, and like that, how do we talk about the places where our election system is vulnerable to fix them while not undermining people's faith in the system overall? And like, can we address this vulnerability of vote by mail, which we're going to rely on, without making people feel like somehow vote by mail is not a legitimate way to vote?
I can give the dumb answer to that question, or the easy answer to that question, and leave the harder answer to Laura. At some level, the dumb answer to that question is a little bit like how we talk about the Russian hack. If the president would just stop lying about the probability of corruption seeping into vote by mail, or B, the notion that there's widespread voter fraud in places where you don't have voter ID. I mean, those are simply lies. And when the President of the United States is telling lies, it's pretty hard to put any other plan in place to answer the question that you're answering. So, again, if I could wave a magic wand, and by the way, we haven't yet been treated in 2020 to what we were treated in 2016, which is, this notion that the election is going to be rigged. So again, sadly, the President of the United States is working against us on this terribly important project, and very much consistent with the objectives, as Laura rightly pointed out, of creating a great deal of doubt and anxiety in the American populace around whether our systems are fair. So that's the obvious answer. For the more sophisticated answer, let Laura have a hack at it. A whack, not a hack.
No, not at all. I think that's a really important piece of it. I mean, look, on the specific piece of the question, I'd actually say that I think vote by mail is probably less vulnerable in many ways to foreign interference than other forms of voting. The biggest vulnerability I would say there is not anything specific to vote by mail, but gets at the voter registration databases that Congressman Himes mentioned earlier were part of the probing in 2016. Obviously, if you can change somebody's voter registration information and you apply for a mail ballot, vote by mail is different in different states. Some places you have to apply for the mail ballot in the form of an absentee ballot. Some places it's automatically mailed to you. But if the voter registration information doesn't match, if your signature on file is changed in a database, right, any of that kind of nefarious activity could affect the ability to cast a mail ballot. But I would say that's, those same changes would be equally vulnerable in an in-person voting situation as well. So I think that's how I think about that. More broadly, Mieke, your question here, I think, and is essential, right? How do we shore up people's faith in the process? while addressing vulnerabilities. And I think it's one of the most important questions that a lot of us in this research space have wrestled with, which is how do we draw attention to where there are challenges that have been unaddressed, while not sort of undermining the very thing we seek to protect. I think some of that is just in terms of framing messaging, right? I think it's really important that anybody who's speaking about the election, whether as an elected official or as a election administrator or pundits on TV or anything, emphasize that the best way to guard against these kinds of tactics and their success is to participate in the process, right? Casting your ballot is the best way to make sure that your vote counts. There's no chance of it counting if you don't cast it in the first place, right? So I think that's one really big piece of it for me. The other piece of it that Congressman mentioned earlier, right, make sure, that you assess information online, through a critical lens, that you really are thinking through the different pieces of information that you get. But then candidly, the best thing we can do, and this relates to what Congressman Himes said, is we can actually take the steps to address the vulnerabilities, right? Showing to the American people that we have and are and will continue to patch any vulnerabilities that are identified is the single best way to ensure that people have faith in the process.
Mieke, if I can interject really quickly, I think, the point Laura made at the very end there, which we were talking about before, is really critical. I mean, I worry about everything, but I worry a lot more about stuff that is not the election infrastructure. Here, yesterday actually caused me to sit up. The Twitter hack caused me to sit up and think about a scenario that would be a lot. Look, if somebody can get 100, mail-in ballots and change them, that's not a good thing, but that's detectable. It's unlikely to have a effect. But I worry much more about the last bit that Laura was talking about, which is very sophisticated attempts to sort of alter behavior. So what do I mean? Let me just paint very quickly two scenarios for you based on what happened yesterday on Twitter. Let's imagine that at 4 p.m. on Election Day, Barack Obama's Twitter account sends revised polling locations to 20,000 Black voters in Florida. Or, just to be fair, let's imagine that Donald Trump's Twitter account on 5 p.m. On Election Day sends out a message saying that I was just kidding about the Second Amendment, it needs to go away, to rural voters in Wisconsin. Now you've altered behavior in a way that is non-reversible, and campaigns could legitimately say, if it was done in a sophisticated enough way, that this election was fatally compromised by fraud. Now we're, in litigation that will make the, Bush v. Gore case look like a walk in the park. And the degree of uncertainty is horrifying. So I worry a lot more about that kind of irreversible, quick action than I do about the possibility that somebody's going to be able to break into the voter registration database in a suburb of Milwaukee.
Well, I hate
but anyway, have a great day.
No, I hate to leave us on such a downer of a note.
Topic, yeah.
And since this is only scheduled for 45 minutes, I will just say the one silver lining of the Twitter hack happening yesterday, other than inspiring our nightmares, is that it happened in the middle of July instead of at the beginning of November. So Twitter does have the ability to try and secure its systems and be prepared for something that could happen later on, which would be much more devastating to our election system. So I am hopeful that
sorry for quick interjection here, but the silver lining is, look, what happened yesterday was absurd, in the sense that, if you really believe that Barack Obama or Bill Gates is asking you to send Bitcoin to him so that he can send it back to you, I have a limited sympathy if you're right. So the silver lining here is that we have an opportunity to educate people and to make people better consumers of information, right? And just be a little bit more critical. And boy, do we have work into this area. And sorry, I don't know what all the answers or maybe even any of the answers are, but the point is that we have a real opportunity to tell people, look, be smart about what you see online, which will not only help us with our election, but will help us in the broad array of life experiences that we have.
Yeah, no, that is very true. It is definitely a teachable moment. I'd like to thank the congressman, and I'd like to thank Laura for giving us a very detailed and enlightening look at foreign interference in the potential election. I hope we haven't given everyone who's been watching nightmares about what's going to happen. We at Third Way are always happy to answer questions or engage with people further. We are so grateful to our panelists for all the work that they are doing, not just with us, but to secure our elections so that every American's vote counts and the will of the people can be clear in 2020. And we are all looking forward to the results. Thank you so much for participating with us, and we look forward to talking to you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mieke.